The truth is never really lost, not completely. It simply hides, waiting for the world to catch up to it. Sometimes it waits in the stillness of a musty evidence box, tucked away on a shelf that hasn't been dusted in decades. Sometimes it waits in the tortured memory of a witness who saw just enough, but not quite all. And sometimes it waits in the single, silent thread of DNA, left behind in an instant of violence on a freezing cold night. A thread so small it could barely be seen, yet strong enough, ultimately, to unravel a lifetime of lies. This is the story of Carla Walker, a life stolen in 1974 from a suburban parking lot in Fort Worth, Texas. It's a story that would haunt a community for 46 years, turning a bright, optimistic memory into the city's most enduring and painful mystery. It is a story about the relentless, grinding ache of a cold case and the stunning, almost miraculous power of science to finally reach back through time, grab a killer by the throat, and drag him into the light. The echo of Carla's laugh scream, a desperate cry in the dark, would fade into the wind of that cold February, but its reverberations would never truly die. It would just wait. To understand the scale of the tragedy, you have to know who Carla Jan Walker was. She was Fort Worth embodied in a girl. Born on January 31st, 1957, Carla was the daughter of Leighton and Doris Walker, a beloved middle child in a close-knit, God-fearing family. Their home in Fort Worth was the kind of place where the door was always open, where life revolved around church, school, and community. Carla was 17 in 1974, a junior at Western Hills High School. Think of her, a cheerleader with a vibrant, infectious enthusiasm that seemed to brighten every room she entered. Her smile wasn't just pretty, it was genuine, the kind of smile that reached her eyes and held a promise of happiness. She was full of that effortless, uncomplicated energy of youth, a girl on the cusp of everything. Her friends adored her. Her teachers saw in her a sharp, dedicated student who had already set her sights on a future, perhaps college, perhaps a life spent helping others. She was still figuring out the exact details, but the trajectory was undeniably upward. She had a boyfriend too, Rodney McCoy. They were the classic high school sweethearts, a couple whose innocence seemed perfectly matched to the era. The 1970s in Fort Worth were a time of relative calm, of community trust. The big city crime stories felt like they belonged to New York or Los Angeles, not here in the safe, quiet suburbs of Texas. Carla's world was a bubble of safety anchored by her family and her faith. She was looking forward to the rest of the school year, to summer, to graduation, to a future that felt limitless. She was 17, and the world was hers for the taking. The idea that something so brutally urban and evil could penetrate the fabric of their secure suburban existence was simply unthinkable. It's this deep-seated innocence, this profound sense of normality, that makes the tragedy so devastating. Her life was pure potential, a story just beginning to be written. February 17, 1974, was a Sunday. But the night before, Saturday, February 16th, the students of Western Hills High School had celebrated their delayed Valentine's Day dance. It was a cold evening, the kind of Texas cold that settles into your bones. But inside the gym, it was all heat, noise, and the excitement of teenage connection. Carla had spent the evening with Rodney McCoy. They were happy, wrapped up in the simple magic of a high school dance. As the dance wound down, Carla and Rodney decided to drive home. It was late, past midnight, technically the morning of Sunday, the 17th. They were on their way back when Rodney realized he needed to stop. He pulled his car, a small dark vehicle, into the parking lot of the Brunswick Ridgely Bowl, a nearby bowling alley. It was a common, unremarkable stop, a moment of mundane necessity that would, through an unimaginable twist of fate, become a final, nightmarish punctuation mark on Carla's life. The parking lot was dark, isolated and silent save for the hum of the car engine and perhaps the distant sounds of the interstate. Carla was waiting in the passenger seat. Rodney had been gone for only a minute or two. The air outside was frigid, still. Then, out of the darkness, a figure materialized. No warning, no sound of approaching footsteps. In a split second, the passenger door was yanked open with violent, unceremonious force. An assailant was armed with a gun, standing over Carla. The intrusion was so sudden, so impossible, it must have felt like a nightmare made real. The man was a ghost in the periphery, but the cold steel of the gun barrel was terrifyingly concrete. Rodney, rushing back, saw the impossible scene unfolding. He lunged, a desperate young man's reaction to protect the one he loved. The attacker shifted, pivoting his violence towards Rodney, pistol whipping him with the weapon. In the frenzy, a small, critical piece of the crime, the magazine from the .22 caliber pistol, clattered onto the asphalt. It was the only concrete clue that would be left behind. Rodney was beaten into unconsciousness, his head throbbing, his world spinning into black. Carla Walker was gone. The entire brutal event had lasted no more than a few terrifying minutes. An invisible, catastrophic collision between her innocent world and the darkest, most predatory evil. The first desperate calls went out to the Fort Worth Police Department. The scene was chaotic. A distraught, injured boyfriend, a missing teenage girl, and a silent, ominous parking lot. The police were immediately skeptical of Rodney McCoy, as is often the case in such violent, intimate crimes. Why was he the only one left behind? Was he covering something up? Rodney, however, was steadfast, his fractured memory tormented by Carly's final, terrified instructions. They searched the area meticulously, recovering the two immediate pieces of evidence: Carly's small purse, discarded nearby, and the crucial, silent piece of metal, the gun magazine. The area was cordoned off, but the cold wind seemed to have wiped away any trace of where the man and Carla had gone. The hours bled into agonizing days. The family, the Walkers, were thrown into a living hell. Doris and Leighton Walker, along with Carla's siblings, Jim and Cindy, clung to the faint, flickering hope that she had simply been taken and would be released. Fort Worth, a city that had felt so safe, now felt utterly vulnerable, terrified. The investigation began with a frantic intensity, but it was operating in blind. They interviewed hundreds, canvassing the neighborhood, running down every possible sighting, but the leads were thin, the trail already turning cold. Then the Wednesday, February 20th, 3 days after the abduction, the call came in. A work group conducting maintenance south of Fort Worth, near Lake Pembroke, stumbled upon a body in a remote water-filled culvert, a deep, dark concrete drain used to channel Wayne water beneath a remote county road. The location was miles from the bowling alley, a place chosen for its isolation. The body was identified as Carla Walker. The dignity of the discovery was heartbreakingly minimal. The full truth of what had happened to her over those 3 days was revealed by the subsequent autopsy, which painted a picture of unspeakable brutality. She had been subjected to rape, unimaginable torture, and finally strangled to death. The toxicology report was also chilling, revealing she had been injected with morphine, an effort by the killer to subdue, prolong the suffering, or perhaps both. The respectful description of the scene that day focused on the devastating emotional impact. The sight of a beautiful 17-year-old girl who had been so full of now reduced to this, cast aside in a concrete culvert like refuse. For the Walker family, the discovery was both the worst possible confirmation of their fears and the beginning of a 46-year search for justice. The fear and sadness that settled over Fort Worth were profound. A monster walked among them. The city was never quite the same after Carla Walker. The sense of safe suburban innocence was murdered right alongside her. The murder scene yielded critical physical evidence, even in 1974. Carla's clothing, her dress, her coat, was carefully preserved. Crucially, the evidence of sexual assault led investigators to collect and preserve what they believed to be semen samples. This biological evidence, this tiny, silent signature of the killer, was the heart of the case, even before the science of DNA was truly understood. They had the what, but they desperately needed the who. The initial investigation was intense, but limited by the technology of the time. Rodney McCoy, still struggling with his injuries and the guilt of his powerlessness, was grilled repeatedly, but his account was consistent and his injuries genuine. He was ultimately cleared, but the suspicion, the dark shadow, never completely left him. Police focused on the gun magazine found at the scene. They identified it as belonging to a specific type of .22 Ruger pistol. This led to a massive, painstaking effort. In a moment of profound hope and desperation, Detective Bennett sent the second stain, along with the original slides, to Othram. The lab technicians, using their specialized technology to analyze single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs, rather than the short tandem repeats, STRs, used by CODIS, were able to build a comprehensive genetic profile from the degraded material. Then, one summer morning in 2020, Detective Bennett received a call that changed everything. David Middleton, the CEO of Othram, was on the line. They had a profile. More than that, they had run the profile through a public database and they had found a strong family match. They didn't have the killer's name yet, but they had a name that pointed to the killer's family tree. The lead was so good, so concrete, it gave Detective Bennett goosebumps. After 46 years of endless searching, he wasn't looking for a needle in a haystack. He was looking at a map. The DNA had spoken, and the voice was clear. The initial DNA match gave the investigators a powerful new focus. The genetic profile led them to a family surname and a cluster of relatives, all descendants of the same shared ancestors. The next step was the arduous, meticulous work of genealogical investigation. Detective Wagner and Detective Bennett began constructing the family tree backward, from the database match to the common ancestor, and then forward again, branch by branch, generation by generation, to identify the potential suspects who would have been in the Fort Worth area in 1974. The detectives, now armed with the cold, hard logic of genetics, worked through the various candidates on the family tree. They cross-referenced names against the original 1974 police reports. As they worked their way through the male members of that family branch, one name, like a persistent shadow, kept reappearing from the old file: Glen Samuel McCurley. It was a staggering moment of realization. McCurley, the truck driver, the man who owned a Ruger .22 pistol, who had been questioned early on and who had passed a polygraph test, the very test that had effectively granted him a 46-year reprieve. He wasn't just a random name from the phone book. He was a ghost from the original case file. The polygraph, which had eliminated him, was now revealed as the fatal flaw in the 1974 investigation. Detective Bennett's team verified that Glen McCurley, now 77 years old, was the only male in that branch of the family tree who was living in Fort Worth at the time of the murder. The circle had closed, spanning 5 decades. But a name from a family tree is not an arrest warrant. To secure a conviction, they needed direct DNA confirmation. This began the delicate, crucial phase of surveillance. Detectives watched McCurley, who was still living a quiet domestic life in Fort Worth, seemingly untouched by the monstrous crime he was now suspect of. The investigators needed a discarded sample, an abandoned DNA source, to compare with the evidence on Carla's dress. Their opportunity came when they observed McCurley discarding trash in his outdoor receptacle. Under the cover of darkness, detectives retrieved the trash, a legal way to obtain a DNA sample without a warrant. The forensic scientist analyzed the discarded material and found a DNA match. It was conclusive. The DNA from the crime scene, the silent signature on Carla's dress, belonged to Glen Samuel McCurley. The moment of confirmation was overwhelming, a release of 4 decades of pressure. Detective Bennett and Detective Wagner had found their man, living out his retirement years in the false certainty of his lifelong secret. The hunter had become the hunted. The arrest of Glen McCurley on September 21, 2020, was a moment that sent shockwaves through Fort Worth and across the nation. The headlines screamed the truth. The Carla Walker killer arrested after 46 years. The man who had been a ghost, a myth of a monster, was revealed to be a 77-year-old, seemingly normal man who had been living a quiet life of relative freedom, a life built on a foundation of brutality and lies. McCurley was arrested and charged with capital murder. His reaction was one of stunned disbelief, the kind of shock that only comes when a man realizes the impossible has finally happened, that the small, silent evidence he thought was erased by time had, instead, and perfectly preserved. For the Walker family, the news was a seismic event. Jim Walker, who had carried the torch of justice for so long, felt a surreal mix of elation and profound sorrow. The elation of the arrests was quickly tempered by the sorrow of realizing that the killer had been right there all along, a man who was interviewed in 1974, who had looked the police in the eye and lied, a man who passed their test and walked free. It was a cold, hard dose of irony that the only thing that saved him was the flag technology of a polygraph, and the only thing that convicted him was the perfected technology of a second chance at DNA. The immediate reaction of the community was horror and betrayal. People who had known McCurley, his neighbors, his family, grappled with the cognitive dissonance of knowing a quiet, aging man who kept a garden and lived a domestic life was in fact the one who committed the monstrous crime that had defined their town's darkest memory. The true crime trope, a normal man living among them, had never been more frighteningly real. The trial of Glen McCurley was scheduled for August 2021. The passage of time had made a courtroom battle an uphill one, but the DNA evidence was the undisputed star witness. The prosecution, led by a determined team, centered their case on the absolute, irrefutable link of McCurley's DNA to Carla's dress. The courtroom was packed, a sea of journalists, police officers, and most importantly, the Walker family. Rodney McCoy, Carla's boyfriend, now a middle-aged man who had lived his entire adult life with the haunting memory of her final screen, took the stand. He recounted the night, the noise of the car door, the brutality of the pistol whipping, the cold, paralyzing terror, and Carla's last desperate instruction, "Go get my dad." His testimony was raw, emotional, a testament to a wound that had never healed. The evidence from the 1974 file was presented: the gun magazine, the pictures of the body, the autopsy report detailing the extensive torture, the morphine injection. The picture painted by the prosecution was not of a sudden crime of passion, but a planned, deliberate, 3-day event of pure sadism. On the 3rd day of the trial, in a moment of stunning, unexpected drama, Glen McCurley's defense team called a halt to the proceedings. The DNA evidence, the weight of the testimony, and the certainty of conviction had finally broken through the killer's decades-long arrogance. McCurley was brought back into the courtroom. He quietly, without a display of emotion or remorse, changed his plea from not guilty to guilty of capital murder. The courtroom fell silent, the air thick with the realization of what this moment meant. After 47 years, the fight was over. The plea deal, a strategic move to avoid a potentially painful death penalty appeal process, ensured that McCurley would be immediately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the Walker family, the guilty plea was the closest they would ever get to a true resolution. They didn't get a full trial, but they got certainty. They got the courtroom moment where the man who stole their daughter and sister finally had to admit his guilt. Jim Walker's emotional statement was a powerful culmination of his life's work. He spoke not just of Carla's beautiful life, but of the hell the killer had put their family through. He stared directly at McCurley, his voice steady but thick with emotion, telling him exactly what he had done to their lives. Glen McCurley would be locked away in the Gibbs-Lewis unit, a man who took a life and then lived a full, free one, finally paying the price in the twilight of his years. He would later tell a reporter that he only pled guilty because he had enough hounding, a final chilling glimpse into a lack of remorse that was total and complete. He died in prison in July 2023, carrying his secrets to the grave, but no longer carrying his freedom. The story of Carla Walker is more than a cold case file. It is a profound lesson in persistence, a benchmark in the history of forensic science, and a testament to the enduring power of family love. The case was the embodiment of the phrase, "Justice doesn't have an expiration date." The resolution of the case did not bring Carla back, but it released her family from the life sentence of unknowing. For Jim Walker and the rest of the family, the verdict meant that they could finally lay the agonizing burden down, not just the grief of loss, but the raw, corrosive anger of injustice. The family, particularly Jim, channeled their painful experience into advocacy, successfully pushing for state and federal legislation to fund and advance forensic genetic genealogy technology, a bill that came to be known as the Carla Walker Act. Her legacy is not just the tragedy of her death.